Hi, welcome back to the channel. I hope you're doing great. My name is Sven, and today we'll talk about two key terms that frequently come up in color grading, which are exposure and contrast. These two functions play important roles in color correction, affecting the image in different but complementary ways. So let's talk about how they work and why they matter. And because a big part about color grading is shot matching, we'll talk about why you may want to use the offset and contrast for that, rather than lift, gamma, gain and the custom curves. And for demonstration purposes, I changed the project settings to disable the S-curve contrast, because I prefer it to be linear, and also because it makes explaining and understanding these things a bit easier. And later in the video we will be discussing the differences between S-curve contrast and linear contrast. Let's start with the offset. The offset control adjusts the overall exposure of an image evenly across the entire tonal range, from the shadows to the highlights. When you push the offset control up, it makes the image brighter. When you pull it down, it makes the image darker. Technically speaking, offset shifts the image along the y-axis of the waveform because it is a simple plus operation. This allows you to raise or lower the brightness without affecting the relationship between the shadows and highlights. It's a useful tool for overall brightness adjustment and especially useful for shot matching. And because oftentimes the only difference between two takes of the same scene is just the exposure or white balance, offset works as a great tool for that. The contrast slider adjusts the difference between the darkest and lightest parts of an image. Increasing contrast pushes the darks darker and the lights lighter, therefore expanding the dynamic range of the image. Decreasing contrast brings the shadows and highlights closer together, making the image appear flatter and more muted. The pivot control is closely linked to the contrast slider. It essentially sets the midpoint around which the contrast is applied. If you adjust the pivot upwards, the emphasis shifts towards the shadows, while lowering it affects the highlights more. As a side note, contrast, no matter how you do it, always also alters the saturation of the image. There are ways around that, but oftentimes it feels more natural to let that change happen. Just know that it is indeed a thing, because sometimes you will hear the term saturation preserving, and we will talk about that in another video. So as you can see in this image, for example, if I start to increase the saturation only, this is the effect that we get on the vectorscope. The colors drift outwards. And if I decrease the saturation, the colors move towards the center. Now if I just increase contrast, we can see a similar thing happening, because the more contrast there is in the image, the higher the saturation is getting. And if I lower the contrast, we can see the opposite happening. The colors are getting grayer and grayer, and therefore lose saturation. So as I said earlier, the project settings are set to linear contrast or disable S-curve contrast. As you can see, increasing the contrast can introduce clipping quite fast if you're not careful. And this is especially true if you work in a display referred color space, or if the image already spreads along the entire tonal range. With S-curve contrast, Resolve applies a rather smooth roll-off to the highlights and shadows, so you don't run into this problem. I'm personally not the biggest fan of how that looks, or the way Blackmagic built this particular S-curve, and there's other S-curve tools available, for example with DCTLs. And also when you decrease contrast, all of a sudden it behaves linearly. But anyway, just know that it is a thing, and personally in a log working color space, I would just stick to no S-curve contrast. Because there you will get a smooth roll-off in the highlights anyway, and you are able to maintain linearity. So why does all of this matter? Both offset and contrast are crucial in color grading, because they allow broad strokes over the tonal range of the image. But also they're incredibly simple, that they only do one thing at a time and don't come with unexpected side effects that slow you down because you have to counterbalance multiple things at the same time. So offset and contrast behave a bit different than the lift, gamma, gain controls in DaVinci Resolve. Lift adjusts the shadows, gamma alters mainly the midtones, and gain affects the highlights. But also they all affect contrast and therefore, as we saw earlier, saturation. So what do I mean by that? Well, if we have a look at this ramp and we look at the waveform, contrast can be defined as how steep this line is. The higher the contrast, the steeper this line is, and the lower the contrast, the flatter this line is. As you can see, if I increase gain, the image gets brighter, but it also gets steeper, which means I am increasing contrast. And the same is true for lift, except it's the other way around. With gamma, there's actually two things happening at the same time. It increases contrast in the shadows, but decreases contrast in the highlights, or vice versa. And as we saw earlier, this also affects saturation, just now in an even more complex way, unlike offset, which moves the entire image uniformly. So these tools are good for creative choices, look development and such, but for simple technical shot matching, they actually introduce more problems than doing good. Offset is a way better tool in that sense, because as we can see here, it doesn't affect contrast or saturation at all. On the other hand, custom curves provide even more granular control and even more flexibility. And I've seen many beginners jumping on them because they might be easy to grasp. But again, because they are very surgical, they do way too many things at the same time. Just look at how the contrast changes many times along the tonal range when working with custom curves. They don't really work great for shot matching in that regard. Let's look at some math for a second. In real life, light behaves linearly, which means when you open the aperture or boost the ISO in the camera, this can be expressed as a multiplication in linear space. That's why doubling the ISO from 400 to 800 results in the same brightness as opening the aperture by one stop. In a perfect logarithmic environment like ACCC, this would not be multiplication but addition or subtraction, or in other words, offset. Apart from ACCC, there's a little catch with basically all other log curves, because they have a so-called linear extension, and I'll talk about that in detail in another video. They behave slightly different from true exposure in the shadows and blacks. However, with most log profiles, this inaccuracy is so small that it doesn't really matter as much. Let's quickly compare some commonly used color spaces, and please stick with me on this one because it will make a lot of sense later. It will basically help you understand which working color space to choose and which tools to use in this color space. And the idea behind this test is that we want to see how close offset is to a perfect exposure adjustment depending on the working color space we are using. Because if we have to adjust the exposure just slightly, a little imperfection isn't really bad. But if we have to do a big adjustment and it comes with a big problem, we should maybe look at other tools instead. So in this test we do the following. Let's say this ramp represents linear light, and in the first node we are lowering the exposure by cutting it in half. Then we convert the linear ramp to several logarithmic color spaces and use the offset to push the exposure up again. And this modified ramp gets converted back to linear so we can compare it to the original. With a pure log like ACCC, it should match perfectly, but with any other log curve we can see a deviation in the blacks. So we have ACCC, ACCCT, logC3 and logC4, DaVinci Intermediate and S-Log3. And the way I build it in this node tree is that whenever I enable one of those nodes, the entire node strip gets applied. So we can see if there is a difference between the top and bottom half of the image in the viewer. So as I said, because ACCC is a pure logarithmic curve, we can see here that it is a perfect match. Now if we do the same thing with ACCCT, we do see that there is a slight difference between the two methods in the shadows. And we have to really zoom in into that region because the difference is quite small. So now let's do the same thing with logC3. As you can tell, the difference is way bigger than with ACCCT. However, if we compare that to logC4, we can see that the difference is way more drastic. For DaVinci Intermediate, it's kind of in the middle, same as with S-Log3. Okay, but what does that mean for grading? So let's repeat it on actual footage. Again, as you can see in ACCCT, we're getting almost a perfect match between perfect exposure and using the offset. In logC3, DaVinci Intermediate and S-Log3, there's a slight deviation that we can maybe live with or compensate with tools like the log wheels. But with logC4, the deviation is so big that it doesn't really make sense to use offset a lot here. So it's probably worth considering not working in logC4 as an intermediate color space, but rather use something like ACCCT or DaVinci Intermediate. So I hope you can see that simple tools like offset and contrast are incredibly helpful and important in color grading. As I said earlier, a big part about color grading is shot matching, even though not many people on YouTube talk about that. So far in this video we only talked about exposure and contrast adjustments, and in the next part we will be looking at adjusting white balance because that's equally important. So if you don't want to miss this episode, then subscribe to the channel. And if you want to help out, leave a like and a comment on this video. And until then, I will see you in the next episode.